I'm Laura Camfield from the University of East Anglia, and I've been asked to talk to you today because since my PhD in the early 2000s, I've been working exclusively in an interdisciplinary way, or at least trying to, using mixed methods on two large international projects, both looking at well-being. So I've faced quite a lot of the challenges, but also understand the value and importance of this work, particularly as we deal with increasingly complex problems in research and evaluation. So in the last 5 years since joining UEA, my work has been more focused around methodology, and particularly around pedagogies of teaching interdisciplinarity and mixed methods, and thinking about how within research projects you create conditions in which that can best exist. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my experiences. So the first question I wanted to raise is this question around multi, inter, post, trans, all these different terms, but what do they actually mean? Well, as part of the Q-squared movement, there was quite a good analysis made of the differences between multi and interdisciplinarity. And basically, multidisciplinarity is where you bring multiple disciplines together, but they might not be interacting, they might not be questioning each other's paradigms, they might be working alongside each other, but not really working together. Interdisciplinarity attempts to move beyond that. It attempts to get people engaging quite critically with paradigms held by other disciplines, and also to think about how their own work can be improved, drawing on different examples. Transdisciplinarity is where disciplines is, I think, very similar to interdisciplinarity, where you have researchers working together to solve a common problem. And then post-disciplinarity would be a situation which is often said we've reached within development studies, where people are less strongly attached to their particular disciplines. And actually I think that can be quite problematic, because I think being grounded in a particular discipline, in my case anthropology, gives you a place from which you can speak, from which you can reflect critically on your own practice or launch into a critique of others' work. I mean, it gives you quite an important perspective. So when people talk about interdisciplinary working, it can just mean picking up methods from different disciplines and putting them in a toolkit without really much thought about different disciplinary understandings around ontology, how the world is, epistemology, how we can know about the world, which are obviously very important and shape the methods in which we use, the methods which we use and the ways in which these methods then construct data. I mean, the very notion that methods can construct data indicates that I come from quite a particular ontological and epistemological perspective. So all of these disciplines and these methods have particular intellectual histories, and I think it's very important to understand those in using them, which is why interdisciplinary working is a very good model. If you move to post-disciplinary, then you forget the history, essentially, and I think you can then perhaps head into some problems. There's also a sense in which, within development studies at least, a post-disciplinary vision could be one that's influenced by the strongest actor, which would undoubtedly be development microeconomics. So a post-disciplinary world might be one where we in fact all become economists. I don't feel so comfortable with that. I think that particular disciplines have rich and important contributions that we should draw on. So that's why, although it is challenging to do in practice, I position myself within interdisciplinarity. Then the second thing I would say is that the nature of the problems that we encounter as researchers and as evaluators are increasingly complex and complicated. So if we move on to the next slide, which is a summary of Gluberman and Zimmerman's work around the difference between simple, complex and complicated, we can see that actually very few projects or interventions fall into this first category of simple. These are the so-called low-hanging fruit, the kinds of things the Gates Foundation focuses on. But arguably all these low-hanging fruit have been picked, and what remains now are the truly wicked problems of development, problems which involve comprehensive social change, which may be resisted by many actors, that are quite socially embedded, say female genital mutilation, child marriage, problems about which few agree even that it is a problem, or particularly what the solution would be. And I think also when you look at simple interventions, so mosquito-treated bed nets, something I've always imagined as a paradigmatic simple intervention, but when you know a little bit more about it, you discover that in fact that isn't the case, that even simple interventions have quite complex aspects to them. Within the case of bed nets, it's actually very common in fishing communities for fishers to use the nets to do their fishing rather than necessarily to protect their families. I mean, it's obviously a choice that they're making, but it's one that you would need to be aware of in evaluating the successive distribution, and also perhaps a mismatch between the successive distribution and reduction in incidence of malaria. Similarly, with iron tablets, Adato's shown it's a great intervention if a single individual gets it, if it's shared across the whole family, if the child is then ill as a result of taking the iron tablets, it tends to be less successful. My third point would be that in engaging with these increasingly complex problems and emergent problems, I mean, Donald Rumsfeld talking about the known knowns and the unknown unknowns, what we don't know that we don't know. I mean, that seems very much to characterise the state of many interventions and research problems, like the reintegration of child soldiers. It's very new, it's very problematic on a number of levels. In terms of how you actually do it, it's you learn as you go along. Programmes need to be quite flexible and adaptive, and then very detailed in recording what they're doing. So whereas with a simple problem, you can imagine a single discipline might possibly be able to solve it. How do vaccines are proven to work? How do you get the vaccines to the children? Once the children are vaccinated, they're not then vulnerable to particular diseases. Maybe you only need clinicians, nurses, specialists in healthcare distribution, but for more complex and multidimensional problems around, say, economic empowerment, then clearly you need a number of different specialisms working together. And this is where we come back to this idea of interdisciplinarity. So my second point would be that disciplines are quite different. We are socialised differently within these disciplines, and we often hold quite different value systems, which are then associated with the approaches that we take. So this question of the place of the individual within anthropology and other disciplines, very, very important. If you have a more quantitative mindset, then you don't get it quite right with an individual questionnaire, but actually it's cancelled out by the large numbers of other questionnaires that you take. So it's not really the individual, it's the average, it's the mean that's the important thing that you're working towards. The place of context as well, is this something that should be controlled for, or is it a valuable object of study and learning in itself? That's definitely a disciplinary difference. And also the way in which you work with participants and colleagues. Is it okay to administer a massive questionnaire to people that takes sort of 4 to 5 hours? Quantitative people say yes it is, qualitative people say no it is, although actually some quantitative people say that there's a clear diminution in data quality as the questionnaire length extends. So obviously there are critical perspectives within different disciplines. I think the final and very fundamental difference is, of course, the extent to which you believe that the data is not collected, but is actually generated through the interactions that produce it. And as an anthropologist or a sociologist or a social scientist, essentially, I think that would be a premise that you would work from, that you need to look very carefully at the instruments that you use and the context in which you collect data to see the ways in which you might be inadvertently constructing the data that you then go on to report. And obviously an awareness of this, and also the way the biases of particular researchers then shape the way in which they analyse their data, is coming into economics and other disciplines. And we see this very much in the increasing advocacy for replication, because few studies, in fact, within psychology and economics can be reliably replicated. I think Ioannidis found that it was about a third, because very particular conditions were in place at the time at which the study was done, which means that it can't necessarily be assumed to be a general phenomenon that's being observed. It could in fact be one constructed by the study itself. So economic replicators have actually found that treasured ideas around the reasons for economic growth in Africa, or the benefits to women of microcredit, when you attempt to replicate them, just don't stand up. And this is a really important insight for programming.